There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel, and this is a very special video. I'd like to welcome back for her umpteenth appearance on my channel, but her first in this kind of a longer form chat. This is Lara from Newfoundland, and she's going to enlighten us, tell us all about Newfoundland and Labrador literature. Welcome, Lara.
Hi, Sean.
So great to have you here. So, yes, have at it. I have read a tiny little bit of Newfoundland fiction especially very modern, contemporary fiction over the years, but want to know a whole bunch more. So that's why you're here.
If I could just set the scene, the literary scene a little bit for some people who might be watching who aren't real familiar with Newfoundland. We are on the very east coast of Canada. Newfoundland is now known as Newfoundland and Labrador. So Newfoundland is the island portion of the province, and then up here attached to Quebec is Labrador. So we have like a big island and then a big landmass and a lot of Atlantic Ocean in between. Newfoundland and Labrador is not only Canada's most easterly province, it's also its youngest province. Newfoundland joined Confederation with Canada in 1949. Made official on April Fool's Day, and some people still think it was a joke, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, and I'm happy that you're here, and we're going to be talking about the Newfoundland father of Confederation a little later, Joey Smallwood. Stay tuned, people.
Historically, we have kind of an interesting history. Of course, there were Indigenous people, to put it mildly, and this is a really, really super condensed Coles Note version. You know, there were prehistoric peoples here. There were the Dorset Eskimo and other peoples, and then there were the Beothuk people were here when colonial settlers came from England and Ireland and Scotland and other places. That's the point at which, you know, our written literature starts to appear. And since then, well, there's a great big gap. And, you know, there are some books published in between. And then in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, there's a real kind of cultural resurgence in Newfoundland, where people start to form a sense of Newfoundland identity very strongly and celebrate that. And there's a return to like folk music and folk literature, and there's a real sort of rebirth of all those things. And out of that, one of the things that happened was we started to get local publishers, more writers, more artists started to identify as Newfoundland artists and Newfoundland writers, and writing about their, you know, their own culture and their own history and their own places in fiction and nonfiction, and, you know, teaching about it then at the local university. There was a folklore department started at Memorial University, who started to collect language and, you know, traditions and all that kind of good stuff. So I feel like Newfoundland literature emerges alongside all of that. I'll talk mostly about novels today. I'd be happy to talk about nonfiction or poetry, even children's books another time.
Sure.
But by way of introducing the novels, there's one book that I cannot leave out and that nobody should ever leave out if they're talking about Newfoundland books. And that is the Dictionary of Newfoundland English.
Right.
And this has been around since the 80s, and it was a project of George Story and William Kerwin, who compiled it over decades based on combing through old newspapers and magazines and journals, but also the folklore and English professors at Memorial University would give students assignments to collect words and sayings and languages from their communities. And so these would all get indexed on cards, and they eventually made their way into this 700 plus page document. And if you're somebody who loves language, whether, you're a Newfoundlander or not. It's really interesting to look at. I used to, when I was at Memorial University, go sit down and read the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, like the great big volumes when I was bored between classes. So when I discovered that there was an actual dictionary of Newfoundland English, it was like, this is a treasure chest of language.
And you share one or two of your favorite pieces of Newfoundland English.
I don't even know if I need to, I'll just open it up to a random page and pick one. It will be good.
Great. All right.
Okay, here I am, random page. We'll do this. Okay, I got hang ashore, Hangashore, and it says see Angashore. So I'm going back to Angashore. I know what it means. I know what it means. I am a bit of an Angashore, I can tell you. Angashore or Hangashore, also called Angishore. Oh, in one part it says it's a poverty-stricken creature, an aspirate and frequently pronounced initially in words with the vowels. Therefore, this Irish loan, Angashore, is often pronounced and spelled Hangashore, and this in turn has been reinterpreted by folk etymology. Then the meanings are: 1, a weak, sickly person, an unlucky person deserving pity, and it's frequently preceded by poor. So in Newfoundland, and this is an Irish thing, I think, and maybe some English do it as well. But if we talk about somebody who's dead, well, I'll often say poor John or poor whoever it was. And I guess a poor Angashore is kind of like a stressor word. So, if you're an Angashore, you're a poor Angashore, which is sad. It's a man regarded as too lazy to fish.
Okay, that makes sense.
A sluggard, a rascal, and sometimes merges with sense 3, which is an idle, mischievous child or person. And then it can be a migratory fisherman from Newfoundland who goes to fish in Labrador. And the more common understanding of it nowadays is somebody who is a landlubber, which would be more like me. I'm prone to seasickness, so I'm a hang-ashore. I will hang on shore, given the option.
You and me both.
Yeah, so, it's all full of stuff like that. And for hang-ashore, what I just read to you was actually a condensed version of what's actually on the page. So it gives the citation, and puts the word in context all the time. So it's like every entry is a little historical essay.
Absolutely.
So this is a real jewel of a resource if you're a language lover. And I know for sure that some of our local writers definitely use it and often look to it for inspiration. And that's how come some of their stuff seems awful poetic. Also tying into our history, but less poetic, one of the first books that became super popular in Newfoundland, and it was in the school curriculum in the 80s when I was in my, say, elementary and junior high years. I don't know if it's still in, but it may be Death on Ice by Cassie Brown. This is on the cover, if you guys can see, or if you can see, that's an illustration by David Blackwood, who was one of the artists who I talked about, who came out of this whole resurgence of Newfoundland culture. And his artwork around the sealing industry and some Newfoundland customs and that kind of thing is really, really kind of dark and poignant, but I'm a huge fan. So Cassie wrote about what was a really kind of pivotal historical moment in Newfoundland when in 1914, there was a ship which was called the Newfoundland, and it was a sealing ship, and it got stuck in the ice floes off Labrador. I think there were 170 something or 130 something men on that ship who got trapped on the ice, not in the ship in the ice, but off the ship on the ice. Because when people go hunting seals, the ship kind of parks and they get off and go, walking across the ice looking for seals. In this instance, these men got separated from the ship during a blizzard, and a lot of them froze to death. And that incident sparked such sadness, but also fury amongst our local population, because it was kind of a moment where it became clear that industry often sees workers as expendable, and almost in a very literal way. There was an actual inquiry into this event, and people have had different interpretations, different opinions about what happened. But whatever way you look at it, there were bad decisions, and those decisions were made in a way that put profit ahead of people's lives and safety. So that sort of sparked a real movement in Newfoundland around people's worth in that industry. And not just that industry, but in the fishing industry. Around the same time, there was a fishermen's union started, and William Coker, who was the head of that union, became kind of a folk hero, and he still is really today. So Cassie's book, it reads almost like a thriller, but it's very emotional, and it was about, real lives and real people, and had real consequences, further down the line.
Is it a nonfiction book, or is it a novelization of the real
It's
story?
a novel. It's a novel. But she did look at the historical accounts, and she did look at interviews with survivors and with people who were close to the situation. And she definitely would have looked at the newspaper reports and the historical reports around the inquiry into the whole situation. So that's one most Newfoundlanders who are, say, or over 50 would know that one for sure, because it was in our school curriculum, but it's still pretty popular today. So if you want to get your feet wet, but not frozen cold, that's a good one to start with. Still not very fun. One that I remember having a powerful reaction to. I did a course in Newfoundland English or Newfoundland literature when I was at Memorial University in the late 90s with Mary Dalton, who was the professor for that particular course and who is a local poet as well. This was one of the books on the curriculum, and it's Percy James's House of Hate. The title really sums up what it's about.
Wow.
It's about a Newfoundland family. I can't remember if Corner Brook, which is now a city but would have been back then a town, was identified by name in the book, but is definitely pointed out by the cover. And because it's semi-autobiographical, we know that Percy James grew up a lot in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, which is on the west coast, and which is now the home to one of our university campuses, Sir Wilfrid Grenfell campus. But it's best known because of the pulp and paper mill industry there. And the whole sort of town grew up around the mill, and the mill is central to, or has been over, decades, central to life and employment and economy in Corner Brook. So Percy spent his formative years in Corner Brook, and he writes this book about a family that is super dysfunctional. The father is quite abusive, and there's this sense of just claustrophobia in the whole book. And it was my first experience with a book that was really sort of insightful and tense in that kind of psychological way around a family. And I just remember feeling like, struck in the head by it. It was so powerful. I recommend that this one, I think, is a pivotal publication in Newfoundland. And right now there's even an annual prize that goes out to unpublished first novel manuscript, and it's named after Percy James. So I think it's called like the Percy James First Book Award, awarded by one of our local organizations.
When was that novel published?
It was published in 1970.
Okay.
There is another more recent novelist called Joel Thomas Hynes. I think one of his novels was either shortlisted or won a Governor General's Award.
Oh, it
one
did.
of our
It did.
major
It did.
national awards.
I read it. I read it.
Was it
I
We'll All
forgot.
Be Burnt in Our Beds?
We'll all be burnt in our
Anyhow,
beds someday.
yeah, he's written a couple of novels, and they're the kind of novels that I would describe as they make you sort of want to scrub your soul clean afterwards.
Yes.
Yeah, they're so gritty and black. And he has cited somewhere along the lines of this being a formative book for him as well. And you could see that connection. Although I had a different reaction to this, like I didn't want to, be exercised or something, but it was really powerful. It takes a really kind of meta twist at the end, a little bit of sociological insight, where the writer says, we as Newfoundlanders were no longer the stepchildren of a distant and once rapacious empire. And he goes on to say, kind of tries to place his experience as a child in this very dysfunctional, claustrophobic home in a sort of Newfoundland sociological, economic context. All of a sudden, like in the last section, which makes you think that was in his head the whole time. It's interesting from that lens, but mostly as a study of a really dysfunctional family and about, the legacy of abuse and trying to break free from it. Does it get more cheerful from here? Yes. Another writer who I was introduced through that course from Mary Dalton was Wayne Johnston, who at the time was, I think it would be fair to say, more of an emerging writer. He would have been big in the Newfoundland context, but I don't think it wasn't huge yet in a national one. He actually came to our class and did a reading and let us, ask questions and stuff. And he was really, really sweet. Some of his earliest books were The Story of Bobby O'Malley and The Divine Rhymes. So they're both set in his home or in the main character's home. And they're both kind of poignant, but really funny, like really funny. And so I always thought that that's what Wayne Johnston was, that, he was a comedy writer at heart. And so when he went on to write some other stuff, it was pretty amazing that somebody can have the capacity to be so broad and so insightful and in all these sort of different genres.
You've been on my bite-sized book chats to talk about one of his more recent ones, just in the last year or so.
Yeah, The Mystery of Right and Wrong,
That's
which was the one that was inspired by his wife's pretty horrific childhood experiences. And Wayne himself has just more recently published his memoir about growing up in the Ghouls, which is now a section of St. John's, and about his family's poverty, really. And his father might have had like a alcohol and gambling problem, and Wayne himself had really serious physical and psychological health issues. He had OCD. And it's amazing that people can not only get through that stuff, but that he can communicate it and, still be an artist. And, people say artists need the pain, and maybe it's true. I don't like to think that way, but if I have great admiration for anybody who can go through such horrific stuff and such challenging stuff, not only manage to function halfway well in the world, but turn it into, really masterpieces. Makes you think about, the strength of the human spirit when it gets down to it. So he started off writing funny stuff. The book that he's perhaps best known for is The Colony of Unrequited Dreams, which is about, its main character is sort of a fictionalized version of Joey Smallwood, who was Newfoundland's first premier and who brought Newfoundland into confederation with Canada. And he was such a divisive character. I was thinking about just recently, like, has there any time in Canadian history been any politician who was as divisive, say, as, Trump is for the United States? And I think it was Joey Smallwood in Newfoundland. He was either your hero or he was a villain. I remember my grandfather would corner me every now and then to talk about Newfoundland history. He always put Joey Smallwood right up there with Adolf Hitler, which is kind of not cool, Pop. But, you get from that what his feeling about the man was and about his politics. And a lot of people, did not want to join Canada. They either wanted to remain an independent Newfoundland, and some had, notions of joining the United States. And then in Newfoundland, for a lot of people, being either a liberal or a conservative is felt as strongly as that kind of division in the United States. And it's part sport, but it's part blood sport. So Wayne has somehow taken Joey Smallwood, the character, and put him in this book, starting as a younger man who wants to get into journalism, and at one point has a pig farm, and another point walks around Newfoundland talking to people. And to take this sort of what was already kind of a mythical character and make him into an even more mythical character, but at the same time humanizing him, was really quite a feat. And he introduces another character in here who's called Shield of Fielding. And I understand that she was semi-inspired by a local sort of commentator / journalist woman. And he introduces her, and she shows up again in other novels that are sort of in a series with this one. But this is definitely his defining book to date, The Colony of Unrequited Dreams. Most well known, it was adapted into a play, which I think toured across Canada. It's not, however, my favorite. I am totally in awe of it, but the book that I love most of his is The Son of a Certain Woman, which is set in St. John's. People who are from St. John's will recognize the neighborhood that the little boy in The Son of a Certain Woman lives in and walks through and goes to school through. It has disability and LGBTQ representation before we even started saying those words. I just think it's a really poignant story about being an outsider and also what it means to be family. The little boy in this has a facial deformity, which, sort of renders him an outsider. And he grows up in a non-traditional home, which is sort of in hiding, but is a really remarkable home. And I won't say a whole lot more, but I really love this book. Yeah.
I've never heard of that one, so that one's going on my list for sure.
Yeah, it's one of his lesser known ones, and I could never understand why it didn't get more attention because I thought it was really excellent. You may know I'm a big fan of historical fiction.
Indeed.
And the book that I think made me that way is Random Passage by Bernice Morgan. I think it came out in the 90s. Yeah, 1995. It was published by a company called Breakwater Books, which is based in St. John's. And when I graduated from Memorial University in 1996, I think it was, I went to work for Breakwater. And this at the time was their kind of star book, and I hadn't read it. And never admitted to anybody that I hadn't read it. And so when I was working, part of my job was research, and I had to go to, out of office a lot of times and do research. And for a few days, I actually pretended to be working when I was actually reading this book. Now, I did make up the time later on.
That's research.
But I was reading the book because I started it and then I couldn't stop. And I remember sitting in the Center for Newfoundland Studies at Memorial University reading this book and bawling when somebody died, and, being mortified because, I was in the library and couldn't stop crying. But this book by Bernice Morgan and its sequel, Waiting for Time, two of my favorites. I have never reread them because how when you love something, you're afraid if you go back, you won't still. I've never reread them, so that's been a long time now. But they were written as one book initially, and the publisher decided they were too long and made them into two books. They're about some people who come to Newfoundland and settle here from England and Ireland, and how they make a life here. One of the things I really loved about it was there's this character called Mary Bundle, who is a really definitive character in the book. And she was the first female character in a Newfoundland book that I really felt was the star. And so I loved that. But also, because it felt like it spoke to home and the formation of home and what home feels like. It was made into a miniseries, a TV miniseries, probably in the early 2000s. Around that same time, I think The Shipping News by Annie Proulx was being filmed in and around New Bonaventure and Port Rexton and Trinity Bay. And my husband and I got married in Port Rexton in 2000. And we go back every now and then to the B&B that we got married at. And I would see people there reading The Shipping News by Annie Proulx all the time. And I would go up and press this book on them because I knew they were visitors and I knew they were reading it because they knew, this was the famous book about Newfoundland at the time. And I'd be like, no, that's not the one to read, read this. So I feel like there's probably a whole bunch of American and Canadian tourists who read Random Passage because I made them.
Lara the influencer.
So if you hadn't read Bernice Morgan, she's written some short stories, short story collections, some children's books as well, and some other novels. Another Newfoundland author who has written a fair bit of Newfoundland historical fiction is Michael Crummey, and he's one of the more prominent ones for sure. One of his earlier books was The River Thieves, and this follows William Cormac, who came to Newfoundland, and let's just say that it was around the period when the Beothuk Indians were on their way to extinction locally, partly because of disease and other factors. But let's face it, we do genocide. Yes. And the Beothuk Indians are extinct, or generally considered to be extinct, because of what happened to them during this period. The two big historical figures in Newfoundland are two women who were taken from Beothuk communities and brought to St. John's. And this deals with that as well. So I can't say a whole lot or I'll give it all away. If you already know the history, you'll have a sense of what's going to happen. But fiction does something that history and nonfiction can't. So I'd certainly recommend River Thieves, especially now that we're finally, working towards reconciliation. This is a good book that helps you think about what settlers did and how we acted, and historically, and the wrongs that we had to right. So I would certainly recommend River Thieves. There's this other one. I know there's been a lot of World War II era fiction, historical fiction in like the past 10, 15 years, to the point that I almost never want to see any more ever again. This is one that I enjoyed before they got super popular, and it's set in Newfoundland, where we had American bases here during the Second World War, and there are a lot of children, or people who are older than children now, with American DNA because there were, relationships. Some that became marriages, and a lot of women, went home with American husbands, and there were a lot of shorter relationships, so that, like I said, there's a lot of American DNA kicking around. So, and this is sort of around that, and a compelling story. So Michael Crummey is definitely one of my favorites. This is my very favorite of his so far. Oh. Galore. Right now, my library book club is reading this one, and I'm going to listen to the audiobook because I've already enjoyed it in print. So I'm looking forward to re-experiencing it through audiobook format. It has a lot of kind of folklore and folklore-ish stuff, magical realism, and it's just great storytelling. So this is one of my favorite books of all time, whether we're talking Newfoundland author, Canadian author anywhere in the world. He's also really well known for the book before this, which is called The Innocents, and another book before that, Sweetland, was the one before that, and that was about, there was in the 60s a lot of resettlement in Newfoundland, where smaller communities were moved into larger centers, and the guy in Sweetland was somebody who resisted that. And so that's an interesting story as well.
Have you gotten to his newest one that just came out? Is it The Adversary?
I just ordered it maybe 3 days ago.
Yeah.
But I think I may hold on to it. Yeah, I saw it seems to be getting really good reviews. I think I'm going to hold on to it and enjoy it over Christmas. I'm super busy now. I just want to let my, one of those things that I look forward to so much. I want to make space in my brain and my schedule for it and just really allow myself to enjoy it. So I'm going to look at it longingly for a couple months, and then I'm going to go for it. Another author who's my recommended list is Donna Morrissey. Okay. I really enjoyed Kit's Law and some of her other books, and she has a new one out as well called Rage the Night, which I haven't read yet. That may be another Christmas break book for me. I talked to you before about Lisa Moore, sorry. I know Lori Moore, Lisa Moore. And I still haven't read this one, but I'm going to read it this February. I think we talked about it a bit when I was talking to you about This Is How We Love, as one that I haven't read because I know it connects to the Ocean Ranger disaster in Newfoundland. And as somebody who was sort of in my formative years when that was happening, I was a little bit emotionally afraid to read it. But I'm going to do it this February. So I'm putting it on my TBR. I'm scheduling it in. The Boat People by Sharon.
I didn't realize she was from Newfoundland.
Yeah. Sharon Paa lives here, and she actually came to our local book club in Torbay at our public library when we read this, and she was lovely. So I'm definitely looking out for more from Sharon.
And her ethnic background is?
Sri Lankan.
Sri Lankan Newfoundland writer. Okay.
Yeah. This is timely and will probably be timely forever because it's about, a boatload of refugees. That's something the world is dealing with.
Absolutely.
Watch, what Italy has to deal with and what, other countries had to deal with. Then we know down the line because of what our climate is doing, there's going to be all kinds of climate refugees. And this is poignant and gives us something to think about in terms of planning. There is good Indigenous nonfiction, and I'd be happy to talk about that.
That might be a part 2 video someday.
Yeah. And I mean, like as a part 2. Yeah, there's some really important, I think, nonfiction work coming out of the university, but also some of our local Indigenous communities about, not just reconciliation, but different aspects of their culture. And I'm reading a few of them right now for a book awards committee that I serve on. So, yeah, that needs to be included.
Well, then I will close this video by thanking you for part 1 of this ongoing infinite series of all the exciting things going on in the world of Newfoundland and Labrador literature, and maybe part 2 will be nonfiction and Indigenous fiction and
Yeah, we could
nonfiction
certainly
coming
talk
from the
about
area.
some of the great Indigenous nonfiction that's happening. There's also really good children's literature out of Newfoundland. That would be a fun topic too.
Lara, thank you so much.